but I just want to emphasize once again, when it's not in use, to put the earpiece away from the microphone. Apparently that's quite detrimental to the translators. So with that, I would like to gavel this meeting in. We have a General Eyre and General Simoneau and General Holman for this meeting on transparency, on the study of space defense. Is it? Yes, but it is. And as this is General Eyre's potentially last appearance before this committee, yeah, I would agree with that. I'd say it's not so, but it is so. I'm going to be a bit something other than my ruthless self with the time, and let General Eyre share with us his wisdom that he's gained. I was going to say he's gained with appearing before this committee, but maybe there's a few things he wants to share beyond that, and look forward to what he has to say. So I appreciate again your cooperation over the years, General Eyre, with your colleagues and your appearance before the committee. It's an important relationship, and we appreciate your holding up your end of it. Thank you. So please, we look forward to your remarks.
So, Mr. Chair, committee members, good afternoon, bon après-midi. As the Chair mentioned, I am here with Major General Eric Simoneau, the Chief of Staff of Professional Conduct and Culture, and who has been leading the charge on our grievance systems modernization. And to my left here, our Judge Advocate General, Brigadier General Rob Holman. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to discuss modernization of our grievance system, which is part of a broader institution-wide movement to evolve our military. Cet effort allant d'initiatives générales des forces.
This effort, from whole-of-CAF initiatives to grassroots work being done on ships, at bases, wings, and even on deployments, is to ensure that our institution meets the expectations of current members, potential members, and the Canadian public, and also to ensure that it aligns with their values.
Firstly, to instill a climate of respect, inclusivity, integrity throughout the organization. And I view as an analogy fitness and the gym. You just can't go to the gym once and call yourself fit. It's got to be a continuous effort. And our efforts to modernize our institution, to change the way that we deal with people, to continue to evolve, they have to be continuous as well. And this is all firmly embedded within the values and ethical principles laid out in our Canadian Armed Forces ethos, which we published in 2022 and which I'm very proud of, Trusted to Serve, which is a foundational document for our military profession, and a document which we've shared with numerous allies to their appreciation. The Canadian Armed Forces has undertaken a number of broad reforms. Modernizing our grievance and complaint processes are a critical element of this work. For example, the grievance system that we have is still modeled after an industrial age system in which organizations favored stability and predictability over responsiveness and timeliness. And those two aspects are required to thrive in the information age. Our intent is to make it easier for members to submit grievances, make the system more responsive to their concerns and situations, and to resolve their concerns in a timelier way. And we've made some significant strides to streamline processes, enhance accessibility, and ensure that all members have a fair and impartial avenue to address their grievances. An example of this work is the digital grievance submission form, launched 2 months ago. And this form is intended to simplify, standardize, and streamline both the submission and resolution processes, and initial reports are good. We're also in the process of establishing a new grievance center of expertise in the fall of this year. And this center of expertise will allow members and the chain of command to have direct access to grievance experts, providing them with direct support on submitting and adjudicating grievances, and moreover, allow us to identify systemic issues across the institution to give us the justification to take rapid action. However, we're not waiting for perfect solutions to be implemented to adapt to the new environment. And we recently implemented a pilot process to clear the backlog of files in the grievance center, or grievance system. This is a key driver of our grievance transformation efforts. Supported by a diverse multidisciplinary team of military and civilian leaders and policy experts, this pilot project has succeeded in achieving two overarching objectives. First, it has significantly reduced the number of backlog grievance files. This work has set in motion the steps required to finalize a substantial number of these files in the coming weeks and months. And second, we are leveraging the new tools and lessons learned from this pilot process to inform our broader grievance system transformation efforts. And this effort at reducing our backlog was led here by General Simoneau, who is prepared to discuss in more detail. So increasing the use of informal resolutions, direct engagement with policyholders and commanders, and the deployment of new delegated authorities are all elements of the pilot process that can be brought forward to streamline our grievance system and make it timelier and more responsive to individual grievers. Nous travaillons à la mise en œuvre.
In addition, we are working to implement Recommendation 10 of the Arbor Report, which focuses on prioritizing and fast-tracking grievances related to sexual misconduct. We expect our response to this recommendation to be fully implemented by the end of this year.
The effectiveness and independence of review bodies like the Military Grievance External Review Committee and the Office of the Ombudsman are also critical to our work in these areas, and two bodies that I engage with on a regular basis. These independent bodies, among others, provide the necessary review and independent analysis to ensure the continued evolution and improvement of the Canadian Armed Forces. So our goal is to develop solutions that are responsive to the needs of our members and align with best practices in grievance resolution and organizational excellence. So we don't claim to have all the answers here, and that's why it's so important to reach out to external experts and be open to that advice. Mr. Chair, it's imperative that we ensure the well-being of our personnel and address any systemic barriers that hinder their ability to seek redress without fear of reprisal. This includes providing timely and transparent access to grievance decisions while also protecting personal information. We are committed to further modernizing the grievance system and care for our people. Our operational effectiveness is based on teamwork and cohesion, and they in turn are predicated on trust in a system that will look after them. Given the deteriorating security situation around the world, this trust is imperative. We must continue to move forward and pull ourselves into the information age. So I'm going to change gears here a bit and talk a bit about you. And I want to express my sincere gratitude to the members of this committee for your unwavering dedication and commitment to the rigorous oversight of matters concerning the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces. And as I stand by you today, or before you today, I recognize the privilege it has been to contribute to your important work. Your steadfast professionalism, thorough examination of legislation, and diligent scrutiny of policies and programs have undoubtedly strengthened our national defense capabilities. I've said often that a pillar of military professionalism in a democracy is its subservience to duly elected civilian rule. It's a pillar that we must continually remind ourselves of, and it's a pillar we must all embrace. And you help maintain that imperative, so thank you. Now, as the chair said, this is likely, maybe not, but likely my last appearance before this committee, and so I want to extend my heartfelt appreciation for the invaluable opportunity to collaborate in the service of this country. Now, I have full confidence in the continued excellence of this committee's endeavors and full confidence in whoever the government selects to come in behind me to provide the same level of engagement with you. And I extend my best and wish you all the best in your future endeavors. So in the twilight of my career, And I mentioned the same thing to a group of young students here at lunch. My second speech of the day, I think this is my fourth, including a group of young officer cadets, that I know this is an institution on the upswing. And despite all the challenges, the dark clouds on the horizon, the deteriorating security situation that we face around the world, I'm confident that this institution is on the right path. And as I told that new generation of leaders, I am envious. I am envious of the challenges they're going to face because this is about the journey, and I would do it all over again. So thank you for your unwavering commitment to the safety and security of Canada, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Eyre, and thank you for those kind words. And thank you for the enthusiasm of appearing before the committee. I can only imagine the enthusiasm varied from time to time, however. So, with that, we'll turn to Mr. Bazan for the first 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and General Eyre. I just want to say thank you for your incredible service and tenure as CDS and your entire military career. It is an undertaking that we're all very thankful that you've been there in the position of leadership during some difficult times, everything from COVID to war in Ukraine and the increasingly dangerous world that we seem to find ourselves in, and trying to navigate through that despite tight budgets and cuts in those budgets at times, and also all the other things that have happened within the Canadian Armed Forces. He stepped into a situation that had the entire CAF in turmoil following one of your predecessors. So thanks for coming in, stabilizing that ship, and moving the troops in the right direction. We're here talking about transparency, and you did talk about that in your opening remarks. And so the chair and I both spoke last week at the Defense Intelligence Conference. And one of the concerns that I raised, because we talk about making sure Canadians understand the importance of our Canadian Armed Forces, the situation that we find ourselves in, how do we change public perception? And a lot of it comes down to the classification of information and the overclassification of that information. If Canadians are going to understand the threat environment, then we need to be more blunt with that information. And this committee, of course, does not have any security clearances. And so the information that is shared around this table, the information that is shared with the public, is limited and only through open source. Do you believe that there needs to be a change in how the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defence handles information so that we can make sure the public are on side with the expenditures, the investments, and the missions that we have to undertake to keep Canadians safe?
So, Mr. Chair, yes, I do agree that we need to continually evaluate how we classify information, and we need to have a mentality of, instead of need to know, a need to share. And this is an approach that we have discussed amongst our closest allies as well. Because often there is a tendency to compartmentalize information that would be better effective in sharing. So it's a question of balancing synchronization with security, understanding with security, and so we must continue to question. Are we overclassifying information? And the default position can't be to put secret Canadian eyes only on it. Now, going to the second piece of your remark. In fact, just 3 hours ago, I was talking to my UK counterpart about sharing information with parliamentarians. And I believe that this committee should be granted security classifications so that we could share with you in more detail some of the activities and intelligence and the like that are ongoing. That's a personal opinion, but I think the country would be better for it.
It's an opinion that I share, and one that I've articulated on many times over the years that I've been on this committee. Richard Shimoka, who was at this committee, said that public understanding the military is at an all-time low and contributes to the lack of support. This is in part due to the lack of open information available and the adversarial relationship that has developed between government and outside bodies over access to information. So just to add to that, I think we actually have to make sure that ATIPs are happening in a more efficient manner. We know for a fact that my own ATIPs that have been submitted in the past, that some of them were outstanding over 5 years. I had 5 over 5 years, up to 7 years old. 4 of those have finally gotten acted upon because Bill Matthews and Bill Blair showed up at committee and heard the complaints, and now 4 out of 5 all of a sudden magically have been answered. Now, we also have heard from former serving and current serving members about the challenges they've had with everything from ATIPs and to the Military Grievance External Review Committee. The Information Commissioner herself, who is taking Department of National Defense and the Minister to court on 3 separate occasions, says the issues are the same and they haven't changed much. And she used to work at Military Grievance External Review Committee over 10 years ago. So have you had conversations with the Minister and the Deputy Minister or the needs to prioritize the information, as well as we knew that you don't have all the appointees sitting at the committee right now, that if you're going to be able to properly represent and stand up for our troops, that grievance committee has to be, 1, more quick to act, and 2, that there is a full slate of committee members?
So, Mr. Chair, two aspects. Firstly, on the ATIP piece, I agree we must do better, and there are a number of lines of effort that we are working on the department side as to how to speed things up, whether from a technological information management perspective or from a process personnel capacity perspective. And you asked about conversations. In fact, tomorrow at Defense Management Committee that is co-chaired between myself and the Deputy Minister, this is one of the agenda items where our Corporate Secretary will be briefing us on how we're going to make it better in the numerous lines of effort. On your question with respect to the committee, yes. We need to ensure they have the capacity, but we also need to make sure that we're giving them the right grievances to review as well, so we are not overwhelming them with grievances and ensuring that their much valued capacity is targeted at the highest payoff grievances. I'm going to ask General Simoneau to speak to this.
Nobody's going to move on. We're at well past 6 minutes. Ms. LaPointe, congratulations on your permanent appointment to this committee. So, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. General, transparency is not only about disclosing information, but it's also about ensuring that it's easily accessible and understandable to the public. How does the Canadian Armed Forces communicate information about its activities, expenditures, and decision-making processes in a really clear and transparent way?
So in terms of expenditures, those are more on the departmental side under the purview of the Deputy Minister. And those are clearly articulated in the annual reports that we publish to Parliament. And I don't know if he had the opportunity during his testimony here to speak in more detail on that, but that's probably the best source of that type of detailed financial information. It's really outside of my realm of responsibility. In terms of our own activities, within the realm of force protection and operational security, we need to continue to showcase the great work that our people are doing around the world and in this country. Every time I get out and meet with our people, whether it's overseas on operations or here at home, I am inspired. And in fact, many of them tell me as they embark on some very important operations, whether it is our mission in Latvia, whether it's training Ukrainian armed forces, they tell me this is the most meaningful thing they have done in their lives. We need to get that message out. We need to continue to get that message out to Canadians. I don't think the Canadian Armed Forces can do this alone. And this is something I would ask you, committee members, to do. In fact, all of our elected parliamentarians is to get out and talk about the necessity of supporting our Canadian Armed Forces. As the situation in the world becomes more difficult, I believe that the Government of Canada, is going to continue to call upon the Canadian Armed Forces more and more and more. And so what is needed is a whole of society effort to make sure that we've got the institution in place and the understanding of that institution in place to be able to address those challenges of the future. You know, what we need more in this country, and I've been saying this to a number of groups as late as when I did my third speech of the day about an hour and a half ago, that we need to have a national security dialogue in this country to raise the awareness, not to spread fear, but to raise the awareness of the realities of the security situation out there. And everybody in this room and listening in can help in that endeavor.
In your opening remarks, you talked about modernizing and changing the way, modernizing your systems and also changing the way you deal with people. And as an example, you cited a significant improvement around the backlog of grievance files. Can you talk to us about how you'll ensure that is a sustainable improvement and not a one-time improvement?
So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to turn to the expert, General Simoneau. He briefed me on this yesterday, but how he's going to ensure that those lessons are moved into the Center of Expertise.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we ran a pilot project, as was mentioned by the Chief of Defense Staff, and we operated as a board, bringing together all around the table all the subject matter experts to solve for the members and to find more rapidly, more timely the tools to solve for the grievances. So we intend to formulate a center of expertise that will replicate what the board has used to go through a high level of grievances within 3 weeks. So in 3 weeks, we pretty much significantly cleared the backlog, as was mentioned by the CDS. And I think that espousing that new way of doing business will enable us to move much faster for our members. Thank you.
And General, can you discuss the challenges and the obstacles that you encountered in your efforts to improve transparency within the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces, and how you're addressing those challenges?
Mr. Chair, I think the issue is the same as many of the other challenges we face. It's one of culture in terms of risk and tolerance. And we must be more willing to take some short-term risk for long-term gain. And we saw that very clearly in the efforts that General Simoneau led to address these grievances. We have a cultural tendency to aim for 100% solution that is completely legally airtight but will take forever. No, let's go for an 80%, 90% solution, but speed is of the essence here. And that same principle can be applied to so much that we are facing.
You still have about 50 seconds.
All right. So looking ahead, what are the priorities for further enhancing transparency within the department?
So, in terms of priorities, it's making or streamlining our ATIP process to make sure that is much more responsive. It is making our grievance process much more responsive and transparent in terms of communication with the grievers so that they understand where it sits. And it is continuing to make sure that we communicate the message of the great work that we're doing around the country.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take these moments to thank you, General Eyre, for your very generous appearances here before the committee and your answers that have allowed us to formulate some excellent recommendations. It's disappointing to lose you, but we wish you the very best, and perhaps you'll come back one more time, who knows? I do have a long question. I hope I will be clear in asking it, but take all the time you need to answer. It's a question that is based on something a military member mentioned to me. He said there had been 3 independent reviews on the grievance process, but still there are delays. The process is laborious. He said there's an old federal decision that confirms that members are not linked to the Crown through any work agreement, which means that the grievance process, regardless of how it is changed, will always remain internal within the forces. There will never be any option of recourse to an external system. I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. is the problem not being perceived from the wrong end? Should we not also consider reviewing the way in which military members are hired? The fact that they're not necessarily public servants. They don't have a work contract or anything outside of what's happening on the inside. Reviewing that process, could that be an option if we want to improve the grievance process? And again, we've already started this discussion, I feel, with Minister Blair when we were discussing perhaps having a period of time for 2 years to see if they like it or not, to have sort of, it feels as though there is a bit of change in the way in which people are thinking of approaching things. So would that be a possibility that the way in which the military members are hired could be related to the issues? Is this a perspective, a lens that we should take on grievances?
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, that's an interesting question. I am not sure if there is a link between the recruitment, training, and probationary period and the grievance system. To me, it's hard to draw a straight line between those. But I must add this. Today, members with a grievance at the end of the process, they always have the option for judicial review, which would be external to the Canadian Armed Forces. So I'll ask General Simoneau to add, if he may, his thoughts on this. Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I would add is this, quite simply. Our employment is codified in the National Defence Act. So we're not public servants, but we do have a good framework for the work that we do. The grievance system is not simply within the forces, as our Chief of Staff said, that you can go before the federal court afterwards at the higher level. What's important is to make sure that members can reach federal court in a way that could resolve their problems. So we need to need to act more swiftly than we have in the past. That member who said that there were still delays, it's true, but that's precisely the burden that we're trying to deal with by adjusting the grievance system, also by changing the way that it operates entirely. We're redoing the entire system. The purpose of that is to make sure that members, once they've gone through the initial authority, the final authority, that they could then have access to the federal court more quickly, so that they could gain satisfaction from that. They do have a grievance. They're very valid. Sometimes we can't resolve them. They need the opportunity to have access to that recourse. Mr. Chair, our JAG also has something to add. If I understand the question correctly, it touches on the relationship between the Crown and members of the Canadian Forces. In the context of constitutional law, the Charter, I would say, is open. It's up to Parliament to reconsider that relationship, as General Simoneau mentioned. It is defined by the common law, but also under the National Defence Act. That's an idea to consider. Thank you. It's interesting. We're trying to look at every possible avenue, and perhaps another question. One of the reproaches that this military member was mentioning was that the Chief of the Defence Staff has the ultimate power of redress, and then if you have to go through the federal court, then it's a very long process. Should this power to redress also be offered to other entities outside of the military system when a grievance is allowed? Mr. Chair, I'm responsible for discipline and good conduct of our forces. So it is my responsibility as the CDS within the system, as far as I am concerned. We need to maintain that responsibility within our force as an institution in our profession to make sure that we can continue to lead our forces. Anything to add? What I would say, General, is this. it's important. We were mentioning the importance of the committee. You provide some excellent advice, which is unbiased and unfiltered, very useful for us. And so I have been with the CDS on a number of occasions on the issue of grievances, and we really...
We're going to have to leave it there. Merci, Madame Normandine. Ms. Masson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. I think that a lot of the questions that have been asked already were similar to mine in terms of the cause of those delays being, unfortunately, at the feet of that link of final authority. There's 4 to 5 years that is held there. So in terms of that wait, that where grievances aren't resolved and the stress and trauma that can also cause, that has a lasting impact. That certainly is something that we have to address from a government perspective as well. But in terms of that, moving out and away from that chain of command with the final authority, I know that you spoke about it a bit, but if you could reemphasize, is there any other option that exists, or you talked about streamlining, you talked about those things, but is there any other option you haven't mentioned yet?
Mr. Chair, so as I mentioned in the last session, once the decision is made by the final authority, the member, the griever, has got the right to go for judicial review, which is external to the organization. And so that is one avenue as well. In terms of looking at other models, I'm not sure if the team has done that or not, but...
So we've done that, and we inspire to a great amount from the public service. So the way that they operate, the way that they try to solve through informal resolution, when they bring people around the table, all the subject matter experts, as we operated with the board as a pilot project, we inspired ourselves from our public service colleagues. Because we truly accept the fact that those delays are unacceptable, and we were trying to solve, and that's where we brought in our public service colleagues. And I think that the big backlog, as we've known them, are a thing of the past. I'm very confident that we're transforming the system in the right direction.
One of the things that we've consistently heard, whether it's from a lot of the external those external forces, those checks and balances, those offices that are supposed to keep our government overall, but certainly the DND accountable, the Information Commission, Privacy Commissioner, the Ombudsman himself, and the military. We just heard we had a scathing report in 2023 from the Military Police Complaint Commission stating that there was a refusal to release necessary information, and that they didn't have many of these offices. They do not have the jurisdictional teeth or an enforcement. I've tried to bring that forward in a piece of legislation to provide them with the independence, the ombudsman with an independence on that. I'd like to hear your opinion on whether that independence is important, or what further aspect of that teeth in terms of ensuring that we are as transparent as we possibly can be is important, or where we need to go with that.
So, Mr. Chair, I will admit I do not have a strong opinion or strong view either way about the reporting mechanism for organizations like the Ombudsman. I do know, and I'm proud to tell you, that we have a good, solid relationship, and we meet frequently and value the input of these various independent actors. And indeed, just had the opportunity to review a draft report that the Ombudsman is going to be coming out with related to what we're discussing here, and very supportive. When we meet, our list of issues is virtually the same as we hear from our members and the challenges that they face. In terms of the Military Police Complaints Commission and their annual report, this is a case of two reasonable actors who are having a disagreement on certain things like what constitutes policing-related complaint, the access or releasability of information when it's protected by solicitor-client privilege. And so they're asking for the courts to determine where that line is. This is a rational way of addressing the challenge. But in terms of the degree of independence, whether they report to the minister, whether they report to Parliament, I am not convinced either way that would affect their investigations. I am happy with the relationship that I have with them and value their advice.
What about the issue, however, that one of their main concerns from that Military Police Complaint Commission is that they actually can't even access the information, that's one of the biggest problems, that there is no good relationship in that way in terms of the release and access to the very information, let alone the rest of the process?
Mr. Chair, given that's before the courts, I can't really comment on it. I don't know if the JAG has more perspective.
Similarly can't comment, but Mr. Chair, I guess the one thing I would emphasize is the importance that the important roles that the MPCC plays in ensuring the confidence of Canadians and members of the Canadian Forces that military police are acting in a professional and independent way. And so resolving those issues is important. The fact that they've chosen the courts to do it, I think, is one that we have to respect.
Respect, but also try to avoid in the first place.
That brings us to our second round, which is 5 minutes. Ms. Gallant.
Mr. Chairman, through you to General Eyre, on October 10th, 2022, I asked you how the military's vaccine mandate was impacting recruitment and retention. So in the interest of transparency, and given Health Canada is no longer authorizing AstraZeneca COVID shots, will you kindly provide this committee with all the legal opinions you told the Canadian press you had received in addition to the August 27th, 2021 briefing memo presented to you by Major General Trevor Caggiot?
Let me just intervene at that point. Generally, legal memos are protected by solicitor-client confidentiality. I'd be interested in JAG's opinion as to whether that is a reasonable.
Possible, Mr. Chairman, if you could just have them, that would be really helpful, because I want to prevent a raft of new grievances, by asking if any recent directives, or for the recent directives and any Canforgens that have been sent out requiring that new recruits must have COVID shots before being deployed to a unit after passing basic training.
Again, let's resolve this issue as to whether the undertaking being asked for is within the legal competence of solicitor-client privilege. I'd be interested to solve that issue. It's a legitimate question, but it's not necessarily something that a client is in a position to release the solicitor from. So if I could get your opinion, General Holman, I'd be grateful.
So, I'm not the committee's lawyer, unfortunately, but what I will say is it's generally understood that in legal advice given to the Crown, the client in that space and the person who can make determinations as to whether or not to waive solicitor-client privilege is at least at the ministerial level and generally at the Governor and Council level. So it's not an undertaking that the CDS could give under the circumstances.
So the waiver of the confidentiality would lie with the minister in this case. Okay, well, I appreciate that.
Thank you. And for your intervention, Mr. Chairman, I hope you add my time that you just used. So, thank you. So on Tuesday, Global News reported that CanSoftCom had a change of command without any public announcements. Why did CAF wait until after Global News reported on the takeover by Brigadier General Steve Hunter for Major General Steve Boivin only after it was announced in the news?
So, Mr. Chair, to correct the record, there was a news release that was prepared, and I'm not sure of the exact timing. I imagine it went out concurrently, but it had nothing to do with any particular news outlet releasing a story of it. There was nothing to hide there. We are working on making a deliberate transition of changes of command, as is normal this type of year, or this time of year, because some of the promotions are still pending. Based on some government decisions, we are We have not released the entire general and flag officer plot yet because it hasn't been finalized yet. But as we take a look at having a very deliberate transition, this is the first of a number of moves, as is normal.
How would you advise your successor in ensuring that CAF be more transparent?
So, Mr. Chair, getting out and telling Canadians an accurate picture of the security environment and the challenges we face and the successes we have on a regular basis, I think is important. I will be advising my successor to come to this committee when invited. Not that they would have a choice, but getting out and encouraging others to communicate with Canadians as well. It cannot just can't be all communication from the CDS. In fact, often our most credible spokespeople are our most junior ranks.
Two more quick questions. So in your opening remarks, you asked about Petawawa. Wanted to let you know there's a little crisis going on there now. You mentioned how fitness was important, a fitness activity with the league. All the regiments in golf, the entire golf course is being shut down, not to mention what it's doing to the children of deployed personnel who do not have transportation off the base to engage in activities. So I wanted to, when you're retired or even before, to look into that. And it's a self-sustaining entity, and it's really important to that community. Now, we heard that some ATIP requesters currently serving had faced reprisals from their superiors for simply requesting information. What do you have to say for those service members facing this abuse? And what do you have to say for those superiors that are currently committing this misdeed?
So, Mr. Chair, any allegations of that need to be reported and investigated. And so my one comment would be this would be unacceptable.
Thank you. Now, we had Colonel Vihar Joshi telling the committee that it would increase transparency to have all the grievances come to him as discretionary or mandatory to receive an independent review and opinion before final authority. We heard from you the opposite. Can you explain the contradiction?
So, Mr. Chair, it's a question of capacity and speed. How quickly can we, and responsiveness, and getting those grievances that truly need to be reviewed by the committee versus those that can be informally resolved. I'll ask, I know General Simoneau has looked at this one in detail. I'll ask him to add his comments.
All I would add is we truly value their input and we want to focus them on the important files. And about 40% of the files are going to them, mostly on compensation, benefit, harassment, and healthcare. And that's where we need them the most to have an unfiltered, unbiased point of view to offer to us. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Ms. Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here to answer some questions today. General Eyre, thank you very much for your service to our country, and I wish you all the best in your retirement. So the CAF has undertaken several significant and far-reaching reforms under your leadership, and I'm wondering if you can tell us which ones are the most significant as of late, and which ones members would have already noticed being taking place.
Mr. Chair, that's a big question as we've undertaken so many change efforts over the course of the last number of years. You know, whether it's on the reconstitution of our forces and growing our numbers. And, you know, from that perspective, I'm very proud that over the course of the last fiscal year, we've grown both our regular and our reserve force after 3 years of shrinking. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that those changes that we've made in our system and continue to make in recruiting and retention are bearing fruit. Continuing to evolve our culture, of which we've discussed one aspect of that, the grievance modernization, that needs to continue as well. You know, very shortly you're going to see a culture evolution strategy being published, along with a comprehensive implementation plan for all of the various external reviews that we've had. We're in in terms of time are those being addressed. You've seen a number of those being brought forward already. The change in focus from regulating ourselves out of a problem to one that's value-based. And what I mean by that, tied to the publication of Trusted to Serve, these are the values to which we aspire. We are not going to be able to put a regulation in place for everything. So as opposed to sink to the level of the regulations we put in place, we are aspiring to the values which we articulate. That is a significant change in approach.
I agree. I think you've said it well. A while ago, actually on April 17th, we had a witness come before this committee and talk about the fact that Officer X, who he didn't name, had a 14-year history of sexual misconduct within the forces and had recently gotten a promotion. And so when we talk about the necessity of changing the culture, you know, hopefully that is taken into account and bad behavior is not rewarded, but rather it is punished. And how can you ensure, or how can a future general ensure that these changes are made and actually have an impact on making sure that this doesn't happen again?
Mr. Chair, this goes back to my opening comment in the analogy of going to the gym. We must be continuous in our efforts to address conduct, address issues that address challenges that are not aligned with our core values. You know, given that I'm the FA for this specific case that you brought up, it's been kept at arm's length from me, but I'm aware of those allegations, and it'll be coming in front of me in due course. I know General Simoneau is more au fait with that case, but in general, our society continues to rapidly evolve. Now, you could argue there's been more societal change in the last 10 years than in the last 50 combined. And what that means for us as we strive to reflect the values and the changing nature of Canadian society is we have to continue to change and evolve as well. There's no end state for this. There's a steady state of change, continuous change.
1 minute left? Okay, well, there's not much that I can ask and you can answer it within a minute, but I would like to, I guess, push on and insist on the fact that this is, I think, the biggest change that needs to be made. And it couldn't have been said better by that witness, by explaining that people are more afraid of being truthful and of being honest and of being good than they are of being bad, because the bad keeps on getting rewarded. So I think that's like the underlining thing that needs to change within the CAF. And do you agree with that statement?
Well, Mr. Chair, I will just add to that. It's been my observation that our members are much more willing to come forward than they have been in the past. And so for me, that is one sign that, yes, we are making positive change. It's not going to happen overnight, but as long as we identify those pockets of resistance and keep moving forward, we have to keep, as I said, keep moving and keep our foot on the gas and keep it as an area of focus.
Thank you, Ms. Lambropoulos. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci.
Thank you. A quick question. Recently, we heard that the Canada Border Services Agency had lost the equivalent of 12,000 access to information requests. Is this something that also affected DND, or if you looked into it so that it wouldn't happen? This was in the context of an IT update. Just wondering if you had taken some precautions at DND to prevent this type of thing happening. Mr. Chair, I am unaware of the incident, so I have no comments. Thank you. On the matter of grievances, again, I've heard some people say that there was officers saying that, oh, you know, I have so many grievances against me. Listen, if you don't like it, you know, you can send another one to me. This is something that they used to say in the past. I know a lot of change has happened, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. what would lead us to believe that in the future, in a situation where you might have a number of grievances that have been received, that have been processed quickly, that there might not still be an incentive to say, I'm not afraid of grievances because the response is a denial or the redress is not going far enough. So will that problem be addressed? The fact that the grievance itself on its own doesn't scare a military member, and how could that be solved? And is there anything in C66 that we will be studying shortly on that issue? Mr. Chair, that is an aspect. This is not something to be proud of for a leader. To me, it's a matter of communications to avoid a grievance. According to the committee, most of the grievances are due to a lack of communications, poor communications. That is really critical for our leaders at every level of DND to have better communications with their subordinates and the superiors. What I could add, Mr. Chair, is this. It's not a grievance. A grievance is not done against someone in particular. It's about oneself. One files a grievance because we're affected by a situation. We're looking at the entire system, and when someone accesses the system through their phone, then it goes straight to the commander of the unit and to the center. Eventually, when we develop it, or we have it, that center of expertise that the Chief of the Defense Staff was referring to. So it emphasizes and prioritizes the member. Someone who says, I have grievances in my name, that's very toxic. It's a culture we can no longer endure. It's something we won't endure anymore or accept. At the same time, we need to make sure.
Madame Normandine, 6 minutes or 2.5 minutes. Madame
So close. Just, I guess, to follow the last two rounds of questions, I wanted to take it forward, as this may be your last appearance, and I certainly do appreciate your service as well. I'm very grateful. I wanted to talk about the new piece of legislation that was born out of the Arbour report and NC66. One of the major changes that is said to be hoping to make a change is that, not a new position, but the change of the provost marshal and how that's taken out of, or supposedly taken out of, chain of command. And yet so much within the chain of command has been discussed today in terms of part of the problem of cover-up, of punishment, of not dealing with the situation. So can you give us your opinion on how that specific change within C66 actually will make a difference, or your potential concerns? So we can add it to that further study later.
Mr. Chair, I think it's more a question of perception of independence as opposed to the actual independence. But regardless, it's going to be the same process as is used to appoint the JAG as a GIC appointee. And Rob, you may have more to add on that.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think the Chief is correct, that I think that what C66 for the Provost Marshal General attempts to address is about perception. Once, even under the current scheme, once the Provost Marshal is appointed by the Chief of the Defense Staff, they can still only be removed for cause right now upon the recommendation of an independent inquiry committee following a public inquiry. That scheme, the basics of it, will remain in place under C66, but with the additional perceptual piece that comes with the Governor and Council being the appointing authority rather than the Chief of the Defense Staff. So now there's a complete removal of the role of the chain of command in the appointment of the CFPM.
Thank you all for appearing today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your service to Canada and to Canadians, and appreciate the testimony you've given to this committee. On the point raised actually by Madam Lambropoulos around the notion, which we have heard at this committee, that it is considered by many to contain more career risk to do the right thing than there is to suppress information. We had testimony from Patrick White, who said, quote, "I struggle to find the name of a single senior member of the forces who has been held accountable for anything other than their own personal conduct." In other words, has anyone been relieved of command for the 2,000 sexual assaults that occurred last year or in the year before that? We're still dealing with these problems 8 years after Operation Honor. So where's the leadership and accountability for the pervasiveness of sexual misconduct?
So, Mr. Chair, I have seen mid-level commanders, higher-level commanders given remedial measures, administrative action for mishandling cases, for not taking appropriate action, and so that perception, while it may be prevalent, is changing as actions, tangible actions, when required, are being taken.
In response to an earlier question, that it is unacceptable for reprisals to take place when people file grievances. Yet we've also heard, and from other witnesses, that reprisals are subtle and they are difficult to document or to track. One member just happens to not get the promotion that another member gets, and members are left to wonder about what motivates any of a number of micro promotion is a big thing, but there are a whole series of much smaller decisions that in total look like reprisals. So how will you address, it's fair to say it's unacceptable, how will you, or how would you recommend your successor to make it, to ensure that reprisals actually do not happen?
So, Mr. Chair, the Canadian Armed Forces is very much a human organization. And what the member is talking about is human behavior, whether it's reprisals, whether it's personality conflict, and the like. And so this is a wider problem. This is a wider challenge than just reprisals. It's how we deal with each other. It's how an individual leads. And so you mentioned promotions. We are striving to ensure that promotion boards have wide representation, so it's not the voice of just one person that carries the day. As we change the way that we train leaders and have much more of an emotional intelligence approach, much more of a sense of not having a cookie-cutter solution for leading your subordinates, an understanding of power dynamics, which is now being incorporated into our leadership training. These are a myriad of human condition issues that we are addressing so that we can be a better organization. But there is not just one silver bullet for this, not just one solution, and we have to continue to advance this on multiple fronts.
Committee also heard that complaining to the Information Commissioner and the Privacy Commissioner is not an exception to getting information. It's part of the process. You will not get your information unless you make a complaint. So in other words, information is not proactively given, that delay is a built-in tactic to suppress information. So does this testimony indicate a properly functioning access to information system, and what will happen to what has been done to address this?
So, Mr. Chair, there's a number of aspects I was actually surprised to find out about in our own system. So, for example, on retirement, not that I'm interested in this at this point, but it used to be the case to get your medical records, you had to put in an ATIP request. 2018, that was changed. It's the requirement or the desire to have your own personnel records. We're changing that as well as we speak. That'll be.
We only have a moment left. The change was made in 2018, and is the problem solved? Do people get their information?
That was for medical records, and yes, that has been changed. The issue with personnel records, and some of these personnel records are quite thick. That is being changed, and actually, I mentioned the meeting the DM, the briefing the DM and I are going to have tomorrow. That's one of the aspects that's being discussed. So these are some of the proactive types of changes that we need to make.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Final questions, Mr. Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and General, congratulations on a very distinguished career, and I have a sinking suspicion that whatever you do next will involve giving back to society as well. So I appreciate your service and all that you've done for us. Let me start with some of your comments that you opened with. You talked about the institution being on an upswing, and you also talked about the incredible pace of change that the Canadian Armed Forces has witnessed. 10 years of change that we probably would have seen over the last 50 years, which I think is very telling in terms of what kind of changes have occurred in a very short period of time. Human nature, though, as it is, oftentimes there are small pockets of people who resist change. That's just how things are. I guess my question is around, it's a big institution that we're dealing with here. It's not a small office environment where we're changing the rules and there's a couple of people that we need to get on board. We're talking about, thousands of people for an institution that's been around for a long time. So when you're in the process of trying to change the culture of the institution in an accelerated time frame, and you have resistance, what kind of advice do you give to whoever fills your shoes next in terms of how to deal with that small group of people who just can't see the path forward?
So, Mr. Chair, this is an issue that has popped up over the course of my tenure, where there's the pockets of resistance that you talked about, and those pockets of resistance, if they cannot be brought along, if they cannot be educated, and often it's a case of education, but if they refuse to change for the betterment of the institution, well, they have to move along as well. And that has happened in a number of cases as well. Talking about accountability, I've seen some leaders removed because of that, because of their own attitudes, which are not aligned with the values we are espousing. We talk about culture, though. We need to be careful about change, because it's not complete. There are certain aspects to our culture we absolutely have to retain. The willingness to put yourself in harm's way to protect others, the willingness to leave your family behind and go to the other side of the world to do good for this country, the willingness to follow orders and do what is asked of you. Those fundamentals we absolutely have to retain as part of who we are and as part of the operational effectiveness to deliver for Canada. But there's other aspects, the harmful aspects. We have to continually identify and address those.
You also talked about the grievance process, and you said it had to be timely and responsive. I'm very, very familiar, I think, and some other people around the table are, in terms of how unions operate. And oftentimes when we see a spike in the number of grievances, and when those grievances are prolonged through the process that they take to get through whatever process they fall under, it can impact morale. And so we've heard testimony at the committee in terms of people who have complained about the length of time that it takes. How do you address morale when we don't maybe live up to the standards and timelines that we advertise when it comes to these situations?
So, Mr. Chair, the efforts that this pilot project we did, that General Simoneau led over the last number of months, has shed some light on some potential going forward. As we stand up this center of expertise and digitize the process, it will allow us to illuminate areas of concern, whether policy or unit. And as General Simoneau briefed me yesterday, there was a number of specific organizations that had a higher proportion of grievances, which means we need to intervene and take action. And so having that type of queuing, if you will, think of it as your intelligence feed to do some targeted engagements. So this is going to help us identify those pockets of resistance that we talked about before. Not just individuals and pockets of individuals, but policies as well that aren't necessarily meeting the intent. Unfortunately, some policies, our hands are tied. I get quite frustrated when a grievance comes across my desk, and I find you aggrieved, but there's nothing I can do about it because the policy is held at Treasury Board, for example. In fact, the Ombudsman's report that's coming out is going to address just that. That's why I'm so keen to see it. But that type of granular analytics is going to be quite useful for the institution.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. And unfortunately, I have to suspend General Eyre, and I just want to, on behalf of the committee, thank you for your willingness to appear before the committee. You have always been a thoughtful, intelligent representative of the forces, and I particularly appreciate your thoughtfulness. You spoke earlier about the relationship between the military and civilian oversight. And this committee represents, in part, civilian oversight. And there are countries that do not have civilian oversight in their military, and it's easily lost. I appreciate your recognition that this is an important role that this committee plays in that whole aspect of civilian oversight. I also recognize that it is our joint responsibility to communicate the importance of what you and the people in your command do on a daily basis for our nation. It is not well appreciated, and I think we all need to pick up our game. I do adopt Mr. Bazan's comments about the level of secrecy or confidentiality or security. It's hard to communicate if you only see part of the story, and I think that's something that we do need to address. But General Eyre, over the years that you've been appearing before this committee, you've shown a willingness to stand up for your organization and for the values that underpin our nation. So I want to thank you for that, and just, if I may, on behalf of the committee, because the committee has no budget at all, present this to you. It is the Speaker's whiskey. So, thanks. For a minute or two and continue on with our second hour. Suspended for a minute. A motion adopted by the committee and the members second. We're resuming a study in the defense of space, and joining us for this hour is Christian Liebruck, Professor RMC, a familiar face with this committee, and Thomas Hughes, postdoctoral fellow at Frank McKenna School in Mount Allison University. So I'm going to ask each of you for an opening 5-minute statement starting. I'm going to since appearing by video conference is always more of a task than personally, I'm going to ask Thomas Hughes to go first, please. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is a privilege to be able to provide comment to this committee. The space domain is a complex defense issue, but it's important to appreciate that although we discuss space, the space domain is in itself an enabler. That is, actions in the space domain facilitate civilian and military actions in other domains. Consequently, thinking about the space domain in defense requires us to consider not only what happens in space, but the ripple effects of actions within the space domain. Similarly, the space domain is inherently connected to Earth, and conflict related to the space domain may be most effectively prosecuted by targeting components of the space architecture that are not actually in space. The space domain is likely to have particular significance for Canada due to the Arctic. Satellite-based communications are vital, and it is difficult to conceive of comprehensive surveillance of Canada's Arctic territory without leveraging the space domain. It also provides an opportunity for Canada to develop capabilities in the space domain that are intended to enhance our awareness of and ability to facilitate and support activity in the Arctic. From this foundation, I will draw your attention to 3 practical and conceptual challenges. The first is the dual use issue. That is, satellites can perform roles that have both military and civilian functions. Thus, satellites that are actually intended for malign use may be plausibly denied using the cover of a civilian function. For example, at a very basic level, imagery of Arctic ice taken from space can be used for scientific research or to assist in military planning. Alternatively, tracking objects in space could be to ensure that existing satellites are not in conflicting orbits, or to generate targeting coordinates to facilitate the use of an anti-satellite missile. Conversely, this raises the difficulty of demonstrating that a satellite is solely intended for benign purposes, increasing the possibility of unintended escalation. While existing surveillance capabilities provide us with a strong understanding of when objects are put into space and who is responsible for their launch, the intended function of these objects and the way in which data that they collect is intended to be used is rather more difficult to discern. The consequent inability to unequivocally differentiate between military and civilian space infrastructure adds a political element to the existing conversation about protecting our space-related assets from attack. Addressing this lacuna through national technical means and, potentially, an international confidence-building regime that generates greater clarity on the function of objects in space domain is vital. The second is the necessary interconnection of private industry and state interests in space. Private industry has been crucial to using the space domain for both civilian and military purposes, developing physical infrastructure and engaging in research. This also represents a political and operational challenge. Over-reliance on private industry may make it difficult for Canada and its partners and allies to pursue their space-related goals at the speed of need and to ensure consistent function at critical junctures. Restrictions on the use of Starlink following its provision to the Ukrainian armed forces is a reminder of this potential challenge. In addition, the sensitive nature of information that may be required by defense departments from or about the space domain complicates the interface with private industry, raising challenges in data collection and dissemination. Third, as we develop our use of the space domain, it is also important to consider how this changes others' understanding of our vulnerabilities and capabilities. Generating awareness of how others view our actions in the space domain is crucial in enabling us to maintain an effective deterrent posture without being seen as an aggressor. However, the ability to hamper adversaries from using the space domain to support their military operations is a vital capability. To be clear, we need to abide by existing regulation and understand the ethical implications of any defense-related activity in the space domain. Nevertheless, ensuring that we have awareness of the role of the space domain in adversaries' military doctrine and the capability to disrupt their use of the space domain, potentially through interdicting communication between ground stations and objects in space rather than targeting the latter directly, is a crucial aspect of future military capability, particularly as the Canadian Armed Forces moves towards a pan-domain approach to operations. Thank you.
Professor Lippert, 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for this invitation. I'll be speaking English, but I'd be pleased to answer your questions in the official language of your choice.
Following scenario. China wants to fire a shot across the proverbial bow, but instead of targeting U.S. infrastructure, which would risk drawing a strong response, China targets a Canadian satellite. China has several capabilities to do so, including anti-satellite missiles and a robotic arm with which China demonstrated in 2022 that it can move a satellite out of geosynchronous orbit. Would this constitute an attack on the continent, or on Canada, or on NATO? But the space domain falls outside of the transatlantic theater. Canada needs clear and definitive answers to these questions to deter malign actors with capabilities, intent, and demonstrated will to target Canadian and allied assets in space. Deterrence also depends on qualitative overmatch of adversarial capabilities. And space depends on Canada's ability to conduct multi-domain warfare. All that presents a formidable challenge for CAF readiness and capabilities. In real dollars, today's CAF has roughly as much funding at its disposal as it did at the end of the Cold War. And the staff contingent is about 1/3 smaller. Yet its tasks have vastly expanded, in part because it has now 2 additional domains. In addition to land, sea, and air, cyber, and space. In a globally integrated threat environment, cyber and space are highly dynamic domains that are integral to the 4 core functions of D&D: reassuring allies and citizens, deterring conflict, the ability to fight, and to protect Canadians. Canadian civilian and military communications, national security, and a wide array of civilian and military functions and operations depend on space. This is especially true in the North and the Arctic, which are disproportionately dependent on space capabilities. China has deployed anti-access area denial systems along its archipelago. Canada must do likewise in the Arctic. That's because the Arctic is a critical vulnerability, where A2AD is heavily dependent on space assets. In other words, space defense is Arctic defense is continental defense, and continental defense is allied defense because it secures extended deterrence, including extended nuclear deterrence. Canada is a regional partner anchor for the Arctic, and Canada's ability to defend NATO's northern flank ultimately depends on space. Adversaries understand this, which is precisely why malign actors are actively challenging our ability to dominate and control the space domain. In other words, strategic rivalry is in full display in space, and whoever controls space is bound to control the 21st century. 4 key takeaways. If the government is actually serious about a values-based foreign policy, then Canada should be joining the ongoing US effort to bolster the Outer Space Treaty, to which both Russia and China are signatories. This established functional regime's deterioration or abrogation would run fundamentally counter to Canada's values and interests. Canada must support approaches that regulate not just space capabilities, but also how these capabilities are used. Canada must make multilateral space diplomacy a top priority. In years to come, there will be 2 new UN open-ended working groups, 1 on each approach. 2, Canada needs a whole-of-government approach to space to forge a coherent national strategy. But with limited resources, execution of a space defense strategy requires Canada to double down on collaboration with allies and the private sector. See the Combined Space Operations Vision 2031, a 5 Eyes effort with France and Germany that I submitted to the committee. Our space policy framework dates back to 2014. 3, space is a prime example why culture evolution matters to the CAF. When the US stood up Space Command, it was quite unlike other commands. Its institutional culture is flat. It recruited from other services, and Space Command is heavily civilian because the skill sets are not readily found in the military. 4, modern militaries cannot operate without space technologies, capabilities, and data. In the event of a conflict, Canadian space defense capabilities afford allies strategic depth and will have a key multiplier effect on allies. Canada's support to Ukraine in the form of geostrategic intelligence is one indication.
Thank you. Mr. Allison, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you, our witnesses, for being here today. Christian, I'm going to start with you. I mean, that seems to make sense. I mean, it seems obvious that we should be spending time and money in space because trying to police or trying to manage the Arctic seems almost impossible from a physical asset point of view. I mean, what kind of money are we looking at here? You talk about flat budgets. We talk about, the same type of budget we had after the Cold War. We talk about shrinking members of the force. I mean, where do you even begin to start in terms of trying to prioritize that? We all know the Arctic's important. We all know that everything you said makes complete and total sense. So where do we start?
I'll give a short answer so you can come back with more challenges on this. But I think ultimately, given the challenges the Defense Force has, and given that we have a pretty good defense policy update, but no real means the government has laid out to resource that effectively, I think we need to focus disproportionately on asymmetric capabilities. That is to say, cyber and space, precisely of the strategic depth argument that I made, precisely because it has that force multiplier effect for NATO's northern flank and for ultimately continental, Arctic, and Canadian sovereignty. And so my worry is that we're actually having too much debate about the conventional domains because that's what we can all see, and that's what many parliamentarians like because it brings money and resources into their writings, and we're not having enough of a conversation about cyber and space and the disproportionate allocation in this heavily resource-constrained environment because that's also what's going to have the multiplier effect for Canadian prosperity, Canadian innovation, the Diana Accelerator that Canada is hosting on part of NATO. So there's a lot of second-order effects if we would focus more on that conversation.
And you're saying, we should be doing all of the above, meaning we should be working with the U.S. in terms of treaties, Five Eyes, all these things, as well as private. You mentioned the concerns about that, but where should the money be spent? Directly through defense, or in the collaboration of trying to wheel with other partners?
So I think what I submitted to the committee, the Five Eyes German-French initiative with a clear vision for 2031, this is where we need to put our resources. If you read that document, I think it is the best articulation in a short form that I've found of the challenges and how we work together to make that happen, draw clear red lines, deter our adversaries, and enable the capabilities that we need, everything from fighting forest fires to ensuring continuity of communications, civilian assets, and the like. So I think we have a very clear target, and given that Canada has signed on to it, the challenge is how do we actually translate that into effective outcomes? Because, as you know, Canada often has perfunctory announcements about defense, but then we have trouble meeting it. And here's one that if we allocate our resources and capabilities effectively, I think we can actually meet that commitment, and it will offer us disproportionate payoff and reputational asset among our key Five Eyes allies plus France and Germany. So this is easier from a multilateral perspective because you have 7 countries playing together as opposed to all of NATO, for instance.
In terms of dealing with China and Russia, who are you concerned with more? In terms of this whole race in space. China's been coming on strong, but what keeps you awake at night in terms of those countries, and why?
So that's a terrific question. If I can only find it, I have a nice little synopsis on that. But the basic point is this, so we put a lot of emphasis on Russia and sort of the Russian claims of putting sort of potentially nuclear weapons up into space. Yes, we should be concerned about that, but look, nuclear weapons are 70-year-old technology. The Chinese have very disruptive technologies that they've demonstrated they know how to use and deploy. That RoboArm, that was a real wake-up in the U.S. and allied defense community. The ability to displace a satellite out of orbit, that's a pretty sophisticated capability. And so this ability for targeted disruption rather than sort of this one big bang, boom sort of approach that Russia takes. And look, China has the second most satellites only to the United States. And China has demonstrated that it is a clear peer rival in its investments, in its capabilities, where we have disproportionate leverage, and the United States understands this, is by playing together among longstanding key allies that have long-developed space capabilities and investing strategically in those. And of course, the innovation is going to come from private sector investment that we then need to be able to translate into dual use and military applications. The problem is our processes in Canada for doing that are so long. If you look at how the US has changed its defense procurement mechanism precisely to be able to accelerate that exponentially, I think this is one more reason why we really need to look at our procurement system, which of course is one of the department's priorities.
Well, and I guess, not that we're going to be meeting our NATO commitment, but we should be investing in Canadian. If we're going to be committing money towards defense and towards those numbers, it should be investing in Canadian companies versus other companies.
If you add up the defense policy update, I don't know why the government didn't put this out there. But in my view, the defense policy update, if the government is serious about resourcing it, it gets us to 2% and more. Why we're actually underplaying our hand with the defense policy update, which I think is a pretty good update. Okay, I'm not quite sure.
Thank you, Mr. Allison. Mr. Fillmore, 6 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks very much to the witnesses for your time and for bringing your expertise to the committee today. In the framing of this study that you're now contributing to, the committee acknowledged that we don't know what we don't know. So if we could, I'd like to use the next 5 or 6 minutes, whichever the chair is giving us right now, to ask you both to educate the committee on the importance of Arctic defense in the context of space And if I could ask you both to keep in mind as you answer your questions what the role of industry is in this, and also framing your responses somewhere along the way in terms of a recommendation that the committee could then include in its report. I guess we'll start in the order that we heard from the speakers, and start with Dr. Hughes, and I'll try to keep the time split in half, 3 minutes each, if we could.
Thank you very much. They're big questions, but to be brief, the importance of Arctic defense in the context of space, I completely agree with Professor Luprecht's conceptualization of this. Arctic defense is one of the niche capabilities that Canada provides, in my opinion, and I think it's useful for Canada, given the current security context, to focus on some of those niche capabilities that it has. The Arctic, therefore, offers an opportunity for Canada to engage in that process. As I said in my initial comments, for Canada to have a comprehensive defense of its Arctic territory, it is absolutely fundamental to leverage the space domain. This is in terms of communications, to start with, and secondly, surveillance, whether that's using the new Sky Guardian remotely piloted aircraft, which I know are due to come into operation in 2028. They will require satellite communication to function, whether that's satellite imagery itself. We cannot surveil the Arctic. We cannot have domain awareness of the Arctic itself without the ability to operate in space. That will require, in my opinion, that Canada engages with international partners, particularly Sweden, I think, is an interesting additional partner that hasn't been mentioned so far. I know that relationship is already built and is already strong, and I think that is something which should probably be leveraged further. In terms of private industry is simply critical. Private industry has the expertise and the capability to produce what the Canadian Armed Forces require. The challenge, as always, is ensuring that that private industry, which is necessarily operating with a different framework of meaning, if you like, from the government, is on the same page, that we can actually work in parallel. We can, but that's not something which happens automatically.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Luprecht, if we could move to you, and I remember you did say something in your remarks about space defense is Arctic defense, and you had more in that long sentence. Perhaps that would help to frame your response.
Yeah, so I guess to reiterate that sentence, so that space defense is Arctic defense. Arctic defense is ultimately continental defense. Continental defense is defending the northern flank of NATO, which of course has become, and NATO's center of gravity with the addition of Sweden and Finland has shifted north. So the northern flank has become more important. But the really important thing, and I think Canada's always done a terribly poor job at articulating this, that investments in Arctic security are investments in NATO and NATO collective defense. Because collective defense depends on U.S. extended deterrence and U.S. extended nuclear deterrence. If the continent is not secure, then it means the United States' ability to deter adversary is not secure. And yet, for some reason, repeated governments on both sides have not, in my view, articulated that effectively, either to the Canadian public and especially to our allies and partners. We still somehow articulate these as somehow separate separate entities, and you can see how the defense policy update was rolled out in this emphasis on the Arctic. I guess the three things that I would reiterate, I think more than just kind of where we put the resources. So one, inexpensive allocation, but I'm concerned that in terms of multilateral diplomacy, we have very limited resources. And as you know, the government of the day decides, and the government has decided to constrain resources of departments further. And the government has decided to put its multilateral efforts in a separate treaty process. Democratic government, it gets to do what it decides to do. But I think it needs to be all hands on deck when it comes to multilateral space diplomacy, because that is existential to Canadian defense and to allied and continental defense for the reasons I just explained. The whole of government approach, the defense policy framework dates back to 2014. A lot has changed in space since 2014. If we have very scarce resources, both in government and in collaboration with industry. We need to marshal those resources for maximum effect and efficiency in terms of outputs and outcomes. If we don't have an updated framework, we can't marshal the resources that we have. And I think on the defense capability side, I think thinking about the people who actually do this. This is a classic example of where the Canadian Armed Forces need extremely high-level, high-quality skill sets. This is a clear change over the last 30 years, that the people you need to recruit, it's not that there's not enough people coming through the doors. There's enough people coming through the doors. The quality of the people that Canadian Armed Forces need, it is not able to get through the doors, especially in these very high-end capabilities. And so here we need opportunities for lateral entry and from the civilian private sector and from other government departments. And look, it's just taken me 2 years to get someone from a different formation to come and work in our formation. That's within the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defense. We are not agile when it comes to personnel.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être une...
Thank you very much. A first question, Dr. Hughes. You mentioned the difficulty in establishing what is private versus what is military in space and in terms of its use. But do we have some idea of the ratio of what would be governmental versus private in the use of space? And is there a trend? For instance, the private sector may be sort of winning in space, or would it be the military or the government side that's sort of winning that war? Just to give an order. Thank you for your question. I'll answer in English.
Putting an absolute number on that is very difficult. The primary problem being that, as I suggested, a lot of the space infrastructure and the satellites can be used for both civilian and military function. So a particular object, a particular satellite may be performing a completely civilian role for a time and a season. And then if the government to whom that satellite belongs decides to change that function, or rather, perhaps more specifically, to use the data that that satellite is collecting for a military purpose, then there's no way that we can stop that from happening. So I am somewhat reluctant to put a figure on military versus civilian. And I think that is part of the challenge of operating and understanding the space domain and the threat environment that is in the space domain. In terms of private versus government, I think to take your question a little further, what would be useful is to see that breakdown by country, because the Chinese government obviously has a different relationship with Chinese private industry than the United States does with US private industry. And again, that raises this challenge of the dual use problem and that public-private interface. I would suggest in the United States in particular, the private industry has a lead in terms of what it is providing. We've seen that with SpaceX and Boeing in recent years. But again, a significant proportion of that need is also driven by armed forces. Again, I would hesitate to put a number on that, but it would perhaps be more useful to think broadly about what capabilities the United States and Canada require in space and whether those capabilities are being met.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. A question for you, Professor Luprecht. You mentioned it obliquely, but I'd like you to go a bit further into detail on this. What is the risk to Canada versus its allies if there is a continued underfunding of space? You've already somewhat addressed it about the Arctic and deterrence that we have to take part in along with our allies, the U.S. We depend a lot on what the U.S. can provide to us in terms of intelligence. But what would be the other, for instance, reputational risks vis-a-vis our allies if we keep underfunding?
Madame Normandin.
Thank you, Madame Normandin, for the question. I'll give you a very concrete example. Today, in the Baltic states, there are current civilian flights that have to change their flight path because of GPS interference by Russian forces in civil aviation. There are a number of airports in Baltic states where you can only land thanks to satellites. We have the same issue in the Arctic. In some and many airports, you can only land thanks to the support of satellites, and Russia is close enough to have this effect in the Arctic. If the Russians so choose, they could exploit significant vulnerabilities in the high north with their interference capabilities within the GPS systems for civilian and military aviation. And that, I believe, is a significant vulnerability that we should address as a priority. Thank you very much. Another question for you. You addressed the issue of Article 5 in space, and the problem being that it is difficult sometimes to relate satellites to certain continents. Do we have the same problem as we do in the cyber field? In cyber, the issue is to associate an action with a perpetrator. Is it the same issue in space, where it would be difficult to know who might have destroyed or what forces might have destroyed or hijacked a satellite? The issue of attribution is actually not that difficult. The problem is that we don't have the capacity for attribution that we are used to, which means from a legal standpoint, beyond a reasonable doubt as being the standard. But through our intelligence capabilities, we can attribute these actions, and specifically the Russians. The Russians, they don't even hide their interventions. On the contrary, they want us to know that they were responsible for this interference that caused the chaos. And because at the end of the day, the Russian strategy is to see the world burn.
Ms. Normandine, Ms. Matson, 6 minutes.
Sorry, that was quite an end point. In terms of that commercialization of space, Dr. Hughes, I'd like to talk to you. I certainly have my concerns in terms of the movement that we have seen away from potentially government-funded space exploration like the International Space Station, the accords that's provided, and this move towards that commercialization of space. Now, in the last meeting that we had on this, there was a belief that in the building of peace and diplomacy, that the commercial interests could do that just as easily, if not better, than governments had in the past, and from that commercial side, that through regulation, government would still have a say in how they move forward. Can I get your thoughts on that?
Certainly. So in terms of the regulation, commercial entities obviously have a significant interest in maintaining the space as a peaceful domain. It's entirely antithetical to what most companies would be looking to achieve if regulation was sufficiently loose as to facilitate aggression within the space domain. I would suggest that ultimately that regulation will come from states. If it is going to be effective, as Dr. Lubrecht had mentioned, this is going to have to come through a state-based framework. Ultimately, the commercialization of space will fall under the jurisdiction of state government. If a state government has understood itself to be under threat from a commercial satellite, then I would suggest that that is not going to prevent them from disrupting that satellite, disrupting those space operations. So whilst private industry should be, I would suggest, heavily involved in what is happening in the space domain and having that partnership with commercial organizations to understand what is happening in the space domain is important. Ultimately, that regulation is going to have to come, in my opinion, from individual states.
Considering the fact that, this certainly isn't new. We haven't, and governments haven't done that as of yet, correct? In terms of monitoring that power dynamic, that monopoly situation like we do see with SpaceX. The American government is now exclusively working to build hundreds of spy satellites with SpaceX, and we saw what happened in terms of Ukraine. The fact that government hasn't moved in that direction, is that concerning? How can we be concerned that governments will, or what are we seeing in that respect, I guess?
I share your concern, again, because the frameworks within which those commercial organizations are operating are going to differ from individual states. State governments, particularly Canada and its partners and allies, will require very robust agreements with those commercial entities. In my opinion, I am not fundamentally convinced that will ever be entirely sufficient. Ultimately, the state will have to rely on an entity which has potentially different interests, unless we end up constricting ourselves to only working with companies from our own states, and I don't think that would be particularly helpful. So yes, that commercialization component does concern me. I think fundamentally, Canada, again, and its allies and partners really need to articulate its point of need in the space domain to understand what capabilities are required and to understand who is best positioned to provide those. And part of that conversation around who is best positioned to provide those is understanding what the interests are of the private entity who's going to be behind them. So yes, I do share your concern. I think the issues with Starlink in Ukraine should act as a wake-up call, if you like, for that potential future challenge.
Both of you, as academics, how does this further impact academia's access to research, and if it's fully commercialized or it's dominated only by one company, as per se?
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. We're on to the 5-minute round, and we have 20 minutes. So 4 minutes. We're on to a 4-minute round. Ms. Gallant.
My questions are for Professor Luprick. We're an adversary to spoof the U.S. GPS satellite system that we use. Describe the impact it would have on our weapons and navigation systems.
That's a great question. I don't need to describe it to you. You just need to look at the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and you can see what happens when, on a large scale, entities end up jamming global positioning statements and the disruption that it causes to civilian life. You have a real-life laboratory, and it's... and in addition, not just the capability to disrupt, but of course, China and its Baidu constellation has its own GPS capabilities, so it is not reliant on the North American system.
What about our weapons systems?
So redundancy is key, and I'll give you an analogy in an area where we've made adjustments. So Russia has, for over a decade, actively been jamming, as you probably know, NATO vessels. And this is why, until about 2015 or so, the U.S. Navy had relied entirely on GPS systems, and why the U.S. Navy went back to star navigation. So the capability to operate without GPS. And so one of the risks that we currently have is a single point of failure if all we do is rely on US-based GPS capabilities. This is why redundancy is important, and this is why multi-domain capabilities are important, so that, as we do in any other domain of warfare, where we never just have one single system on which we are reliant. And I'm concerned about the over-reliance in Canada on potential single points of failure in space.
So we don't have a backup the way the U.S. Navy has the star navigational system.
I better let the Canadian Armed Forces speak to the redundancy capabilities that we have.
Okay. Okay, so when Russia deploys an anti-satellite weapon into space, such as putting multiple nuclear weapons in orbit, does Canada or any ally have the right to disable the weapon if it poses an imminent threat to our satellites?
I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you. You'd need to ask the JAG on what the international law constraints are and our proper legal constraints. As I pointed out in my opening statement, I'm concerned that we in Canada have not done enough heavy lifting to answer precisely these types of questions, what our response would be and what our cooperation, both with the United States and among other allied partners, in particular middle power partners, would be. If the United States is busy in other conflicts, we need to be able to respond with other partners.
Okay, so we're a foreign adversary to hack into a satellite or a satellite network to disable or hijack it. Would that constitute an act of war, or what type of response would be justified on the part of Canada or any other nations this happened to, who are signatories on the Outer Space Treaty?
So my best understanding is that the problem is that the answers to precisely these questions are currently ambiguous. Precisely because, for instance, NATO Article 5, it's not clear. Would that apply? Under what circumstances would it apply? What aspects other than the 5 space treaties to which Canada is a signatory would apply in this domain? And this is precisely why the UN has proposed an open-ended working group on both capabilities and a separate one on behaviors. There's a problem of agreement on the parameters of those working groups, but I'm confident those will get off the ground in the very near future. And Canada, of course, needs to be prepared to be a very active player, as hard as it's going to be to get an international consensus.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Ms. Lalonde, I think you're deferring your time to Mr. Fillmore. Is that correct? Mr. Fillmore, 4 minutes.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to go a little further on the topic raised by Ms. Matheson, if I could. We've heard from Dr. Hughes about, I don't know, let's call them the ambiguities in the legal framework governing space security, and very likely the development of shared behavioral norms. That just came up in the last question, actually. But Dr. Leuprecht, you said that Canada must join the ongoing effort to bolster the U.S. space treaty and that multilateral diplomacy has to be a priority. Well, historically, space treaties have been negotiated between nation states. But as we've heard this evening, the private sector is having a more and more active role in space. So it seems like the place we need to get to is where private entities, the industry sector, needs to be participating in these treaties. Is there any precedent? Do we have any tools that can help private sector to involve themselves in the treaties, such as the one you've mentioned? Maybe we could start with Dr. Leuprecht and then Dr. Hughes, if there's time.
I just have a short answer for you. It is actually one of the strengths that Canada has. Because we're smaller, it's much easier for government departments and agencies to talk to one another, and for us to talk to both non-governmental organizations and the private sector, and to forge a common way forward in how we harness that. So we have a comparative advantage to the United States, where, of course, this is a rather large behemoth to try to figure out where the bus is going and to get everybody on that bus.
So, for example, in our work that you recommend that we undertake with the United States on updating the space treaty, is there a role for the private sector to be present at that table? Either one of you.
I'll defer on that question in the sense that I don't know enough about the technicalities of how space treaties are negotiated.
Okay. Dr. Hughes, is there anything you'd like to add to that in answer to that?
Just to build a little bit on Dr. Leuprecht's point, I would suggest that a place at the table in terms of international discussion probably is not the place for private industry. However, it absolutely is the case that private industry should be heavily involved when the negotiating positions are being created by the states. Because, again, as we've heard within this conversation, private industry have been so heavily involved in the development of space technology and space capabilities, that having them as part of that discussion to an extent is going to be critical. And also, if I may, just to point to the recommendations that you'd suggested, I think one first recommendation that I would have is that we really simply need a clear articulation of our needs with regards to defence in the space domain. It is such a huge topic and brings together so many different facets of Canadian life that articulation is simply not there at the moment. We have a broad collection of understandings of the consequences of action in the space domain, but to bring that together into a coherent package would be really very useful.
Okay, thank you both very much. I think I'm probably out of time.
You aren't, but where you are now. Minute and a half, Ms. Normandine.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur
Thank you very much. Professor Lubrecht, in your notes you mentioned the importance of regulating not only space capabilities, but also their use. For instance, we've seen with dual use, it's very difficult. Satellite imagery can be used both can be used for military purposes. I'd like to hear what you have to say about the actual real possibility that we could regulate, or there could be regulations, especially given the fact that people might have malicious intent. Think of China claiming that things are done for civilian purposes, but they're actually done for military purposes. Is it realistic to have regulations on the use of space? Yes, ma'am, because there is a strong incentive, and that would be the economy of space. In other words, the capacity for resources that are in space, or the economy of space. It's about $600 billion a year we're talking about. By 2035, the economy will be at $1.3 trillion, specifically to mine resources in space, actually, and to deploy the necessary resources to take advantage of this economy in space. There need to be international regulations as to the use of capabilities, the use of the technology that is used in space.
Dean, Ms. Massa, a minute and a half.
Dr. Lubrecht, you sent us the combined space operations vision. It stated some nations have developed capabilities designed to deny, degrade, disrupt access and the utilization of space-based capabilities. And then it talked about the goal of collaboration across a range of measures, developing requirements for current future systems to counter hostile space activities, to deter, deny, or defeat attacks or interference with space enterprise. Now, if we're looking back at history, there's this consistence of the horrific ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons existing today because they're a process or a product of, a cycle of anti-missile system defense systems, and they spur innovations, and that creates bigger weapons and more so in terms of that arms race. This is the final frontier, I guess, if we want to get geeky about it. So how do we not make the same mistakes that we have here on Earth as in space? How do we deter? How do we find that diplomacy in this current world we live in?
And we have a peer competitor, strategic rival in China, which is able to compete at scale in space with the United States and with the Western Alliance. And the effort of China, of course, to disrupt the status quo of the rules-based order, not just on Earth, but in cyberspace and in space. And of course, Canada, as a middle power, has a key interest in preserving the status quo. And that's why Canada has a keen interest in establishing clear behavioral norms. But I think the incentive is space mining, precisely because that's where the opportunity is the same for China as it is for all other countries. And I think one of the opportunities Canada has is to ensure, for instance, equal access to space. How do we get other countries to come on board with our approaches to space? We ensure equal access to space, and we ensure ethical access to space.
We're going to have to leave the answer there, please. Thank you. Mr. Bazan, 4 minutes. 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both our witnesses. So you're talking about increasing space diplomacy with our adversaries, and I'm sure you're meaning Russia and the People's Republic of China. I looked at the Outer Space Treaty. It was signed in 1967 with the USSR, so technically not Russia, but you hope Russia is still going to abide by it. But, of course, Russia is talking about the using nuclear weapons in space. Do we trust the Russian Federation or Vladimir Putin and the People's Republic of China to actually honor any treaty that they sign?
So my argument to this would be is there needs to be a two-level effort, right? So the effort that we just talked about in terms of building international norms, what Canada has traditionally done well, but which, for instance, in the cyber domain for 25 years has not gotten us anywhere. So in the absence of international norms, we need to work on deterrence, and we need to work on capabilities for certain elements of punishment, whether it's kinetic or non-kinetic, for countries that cross over certain red lines. And we also need to do that, I think, outside of U.S. leadership.
Do you think the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China is going to sign it? Because you're familiar with the Budapest Memorandum, I'm sure, and Russia didn't honor that when they invaded Ukraine. I'm sure you're familiar with Minsk I and Minsk II treaties, and the Russian Federation never honored those. They were supposed to be on the nuclear non-proliferation. They were supposed to reduce the overall nuclear arsenal they had, and instead they've ramped up the production of nuclear weapons. And then Beijing had signed with the United Kingdom the Sino-British Joint Declaration Treaty, and that was supposed to be good till 2047, and they walked away from it in 2014. So why would we trust anyone to sign this when they're both very interested in having that strategic advantage in space?
And that's why we're in front of the National Defense Committee and not the Foreign Affairs Committee, precisely because we need those deterrence capabilities, because the other way, if we can't agree on norms, we can forge norms if our adversaries know there are very real consequences on which we are prepared to follow through if they cross certain red lines. Thomas might have something to say on this as well.
Yes, thank you. It's a fascinating question, and I would suggest that the first answer and short answer is no. We simply cannot assume that simply because rules are in place that they will be followed. I think it is worth noting that Russia and China have both proposed some forms of rules in space. I think it's also worth noting that Russia has rejected the approach of norms regarding space activities and suggested that a fully legal regime would be more appropriate. My inclination in that is that particularly Russia will use the rules to the extent that they benefit Russia. So if we are going to develop a rules-based framework, which I do think would be helpful, we have to bear in mind that Russia must see it as being at least of parallel benefit to them as to what they consider to be their peers. The key point in the whole conversation around space military activity, in my opinion, is verification. So if we can create a framework of rules which facilitate some form of verification that we are confident provides us with sufficient information on the capabilities that Russia and China are deploying and the capabilities that they are attempting to deploy, and from there develop an understanding of their intent in the space domain, then those rules and regulations can be useful in their own right, even if we also need to augment them by the deterrent function that Dr. Liebrecht mentioned.
We're unfortunately going to have to leave the answer there. Thank you. Ms. Lalonde, 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I want to say thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. I was very happy to see that we were undertaking a study actually on space defense, and I think you're validating the notion of why this is so important, particularly in this committee. There was also references about space defense being, and I'll quote, emerging domain, and certainly the development that are occurring at an increasingly rapid pace, and we're talking about that dollar figure, but also just the reality of where that brings us. I would like to know from both of you, are there barriers to researching space defense as an emerging domain? And if there's a lack of information on existing research, data, or sources to rely on? Merci.
So 2 points on that. If you look at Australia, Australia has a Centre for Space Governance. We have nothing comparable in this country. So we need to generate the capabilities of what are our interests and how do we assert them in a multilateral governance framework. It is something I think we have not quite grasped in terms of, and it requires government leadership. The other is my concern about research security, because Ms. Matheson, Madame Normandin, others have talked about the research investments and capabilities. The government has put forward, finally, a framework on research security, but it, of course, does not include any private sector actors in China. It only includes public sector research, military intelligence institutions. And so we need to understand that if we're going to invest in research in this country, in space, that we need to provide adequate research security. And adequate research security means we can't then collaborate or let people collaborate with Chinese entities that are going to leverage the dual-use capabilities that Canadian taxpayers are paying for to advance Chinese capabilities in space.
Thank you. Mr. Hughes.
Just to add on to that point briefly, the funding incentivization point is going to be critical here as well. So if we are going to have meaningful research, particularly around space defense in the academic realm and around laws governing the military component of space, then the funding needs to be there for that to happen. And where does that incentivization come from? And the ability for scholars to engage in that research process requires that those funds are available as well.
Thank you very much. And maybe I'll leave you both to share very quickly key recommendation that we could be bringing forward as this is a study that we're doing on space defense.
A higher risk tolerance for government to invest in research capabilities, and the willingness to fail and to fail quickly and subvent the private sector by putting that out. We've built some of that in defense, but we've been very reticent at allowing that investment to go towards defense, to go towards space capabilities.
Yeah, okay. And Dr. Hughes?
I would reiterate my point about fundamental understanding and articulation of needs regarding space, and a second recommendation from there is understanding Canada's niche capabilities and opportunities within that multilateral defense framework.
Thank you very much.
And unfortunately, I have to gavel this meeting to a close. You've raised some really interesting points, which I hope the committee will have an opportunity to explore. Before I do adjourn, however, I just take note that we are meeting with Minister Pistorius from the German Defense Ministry on Friday at 12:15 in room 125B West Block, and I'd like to exchange a gift with him, and I appreciate it if someone would be in a position to move a motion to do so. Ms. Lalonde.
Mr. Chair, it'll be a pleasure for me to help you on this, and I think at the will of the committee. And I'll bring this motion that in relation to the committee's informal meeting with the German Minister of Defense, the committee covered the cost of a gift for the German Defense Minister.
Okay, thank you. Any debate? Good. Seems a little excessive. Having said that, colleagues, the next meeting is on Wednesday, the 22nd. We'll be dealing with the procurement report, so you have lots of time to read it. 27th, Minister Blair on mains, and on the 29th, we'll consider we'll go on to a procurement consideration, but also there will be a Latvian delegation with whom we're having lunch. Mr. Bazan.
So originally, Minister Blair is going to be here on the 22nd. You delayed it 5 days. Does that impact on our ability to report back?
No.
When's the date? For 31st? Okay.
I asked I would. Okay, with that, meeting adjourned. Again, thank you to both of you for your participation.